Hi everyone, welcome back to Two Nobodies. Rupesh Patel here. Really excited for my guest today, who I'm going to introduce in a second. If you guys have been loving this podcast, please always like and subscribe. I haven't really said that too much. I feel like it's kind of cheap a little bit. Everyone seems to say that, but I definitely have been encouraged to say that by a few people, so I will do that for those folks there. But our guest today is Jason Anastasopoulos. Oh my goodness, Jason, I already messed up your last. Yeah, Anastasopoulos. And I feel like Charles Barkley right now trying to say Giannis's last name.
The person who announced my name during my PhD graduation got it wrong. So they were like, it was hilarious. And he was totally embarrassed, but I didn't really care, so don't worry about it. It's Anastasopoulos, but whatever. It's fine.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. I appreciate also that you're allowing me to go by Jason, because that just makes it a whole lot easier. I feel a little ashamed too, because I actually had a few Greek friends growing up, and I needed to say these last names, and so and I was practicing too. This is completely embarrassing, but anyways, appreciate that you're letting that go. I have Jason here to talk about a topic that we have introduced into our podcast, I would say probably about a couple months ago, which was on the fourth industrial revolution. And Jason, just a little bit of context and background and sort of why we went down that route. I think Kyle and I just kind of saw that as an area that was really interesting because it touches on so many issues, and obviously relevant for we have young kids, and we talk about parenting and fatherhood a lot, and just like what it's going to look like for our kids. But obviously we're still at a working age, and what is it going to look like for us? And so we thought there were so many angles that you could come at that topic at. So we've had conversations, just Kyle and I kind of just exploring the different, first, second, third, fourth industrial revolutions. We had somebody come in and talk about sort of needing to redesign an economy that really works for all of us, and that was really interesting. For me, on a personal level, though, is an interest in democracy overall. And this, democracy has been, I feel like a topic of discussion that's really been brought up a lot over the last, 4 to 6 years, more recently. And so my thinking was, let's find somebody who can talk to us about their thoughts on how does democracy move forward as the fourth industrial revolution is taking shape, as we have these disruptive technologies. What does that do? And lo and behold, you Google this, and your name just kind of pops up right there, which is fantastic. And so, really interested to talk to you about that. But you're teaching at Georgia, right?
Yeah, University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. Yep.
Are you living there?
Yep.
So you got to give. I mean, as Canadians, we're always fascinated by U.S. politics. And Georgia seemed to be, the center of some stuff in the 2020 election. Yeah. What was it like, if you don't mind me asking? It seems like 2020 election was so far away, but the fact that, this election is still, people are still believing that it wasn't a real thing, still kind of maybe makes it a little relevant. But what was the 2020 election like for someone who was a Georgian?
Yeah, so my experience of the election was one of just like nothing really, it's weird, like nothing really changed other than what I was interacting with through the screen, right? So there was a lot of course, discussion about the ballots, and Raffensperger and Kemp and Donald Trump was going around, if you remember, saying, Kemp is a rhino, all this other stuff. But to be honest with you, like nothing actually really happened per se in the state, and so I didn't notice that much of a difference. But it was just interesting, being in a place which is the focus of so much national attention, and that was kind of interesting. But like the thing is, it's just when you see things on the news, at least for me, it's just hard to make any heads or tails of what is true and what is not. So I don't even I kind of like I was like I don't know what's happening here, because
Mm.
one party was claiming that there was fake ballots, and another was saying that. So I was like, I don't know what's going on here, but it was kind of exciting just to be in the state at the time. But again, it was like always just mediated through like the news. Like I didn't, I live kind of far away from Atlanta, which is really where the main action was
Okay.
happening.
Yep.
So yeah, it was just like I guess just like being anywhere else in some ways, in many ways, really. Yeah.
Do you think Georgians are, and would you, folks from Georgia, do they call themselves Georgians? That's an assumption that I have.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I've only been here for 4 years. I think so. Yeah, I think Georgians is the right way to put it. Yeah,
Okay.
just like the people from the country, Georgia, right? But yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
That's that. Yeah, that's my guess. But if you don't know, that's all good too. Do you think that Georgians are really? Is that going to raise people's participation? Would you say for upcoming elections because there's a sense of that they played a role in the 2020 election?
yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think a lot of it is going to depend on the kind of the whole COVID situation. Although even that,
Mm.
I don't think will affect participation that much. But I do believe that what you're going to see in the midterm elections, which are these elections coming up,
Mm.
is you will see a lot more. And now, this is actually a typical thing in midterm elections. More Republicans tend to come out.
Mm.
So even though there was an anomaly that happened in 2018, where you saw the kind of
Mm.
opposite phenomenon, but
Yep.
I think what you're going to see in the midterms, if everything is copacetic and there aren't big controversies about counting votes for several months, right? You're going to see more Republican turnout, in my opinion, and so I
Mm.
think that's probably something that is going to happen, and that's what I would expect, like more Republican participation. I think the governor is up for re-election. I gotta double check on that, but that's obviously very important
Mm.
seat. So yeah, and it's gonna get pretty crazy around November, in my opinion.
What's because there was a voting rights bill that was passed, I think, recently in
Right,
Georgia.
right.
That if you're saying that more Republicans typically show up, my understanding of or the controversy around this bill is that it's probably not going to favor Democratic voters,
Yeah,
just
I mean
because of
that's
sort
what
of the
they say.
demographics
Like,
around
yeah,
Democrats.
for sure. Like that's what they say, but I mean the bill is. So I heard a lot about the bill on Twitter and news sites, so I decided to check it out myself. And
Mm.
the bill is extremely. It's like a very, very, very mild version of a voter ID kind of, in that it
Mm.
basically applies mostly to absentee ballots, and the major requirement, if
Okay.
I remember correctly, is, and there's actually a really good there are really good articles on this actually published by like CBS, I think CBS Broadcasting, um, or whatever their online site. But I remember the major part of the bill was that on an absentee ballot, you have to put some identifying information. So whether that be your Georgia driver's license, I think that was the major, or like a Georgia state ID. I think like those were the two major pieces of information that you had to present. But
Okay.
you had to just write the number on the ballot, or else it would be discarded, right? So
Mm.
I don't really. I know there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of people who don't like the bill, but I just don't see it affecting turnout that much either way. You know,
Mm.
um, because it's just the additional requirement above what you would have to show at a polling station is just not. It's not that great. Now, is it now? Other studies have found in the past that when you would have voter requirements, that it tends to hurt the Democratic Party. But even those studies are not that good, and and I don't think there's any conclusive results, just because there have been so few voter restrictions, other than the ones that
Right.
you used to have back in like the 1920s and things like that during the era of Jim Crow. But that was a totally different thing. I mean, that like those were like in that age you had literacy tests imposed and things like that. I mean, writing down an ID number is not like anywhere near that. So so I just don't think it will happen.
The timing of this whole thing, though, Jason, just seems a little bit weird to me. Just because this whole big lie thing is still kind of out there, and it seems like legislators are perhaps maybe responding to that. Like that's what the optics kind of look like. I don't know if there's truth to that or not, but that's sort of what it looks like. And so you kind of from afar it seems, without kind of knowing the exact details of the bill, it does seem like it's trying to do something to restrict some of that turnout. I don't know, but
yeah, I mean, so the thing is, I think that every party does try to get their best advantage. So I think it's possible that the goal is probably to help Republicans, right? So I wouldn't doubt that that's the goal. I'm just saying I don't think it's going to matter.
yeah,
Like
okay,
like
fair.
even though that's the goal. So that's kind of like where I'm at. Like I don't think the effect is going to be that great. Like certainly not as big as all the hoopla that was going on around surrounding it. Like all the discussions about it. But yeah, I mean, I certainly, of course, the voter ID bills are, they're meant to help the Republicans because Republicans pass them, and that's kind of like, yeah, I mean, just that's just for sure. I think that's part of the goal, but I just don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. To tell you the truth, yeah, especially because it does, unless here's the thing. So if there's like lockdowns and things like that, and this 100% absentee ballots, well, that's going to be different, right?
Yeah. Because I think I heard that they're restricting the number of drop boxes and something like that as part of the bill. And so yeah, I guess if you have to have absentee ballots and you don't have access for people to drop their ballots, that's probably going to change things.
Yeah. No, I mean, it could quite possibly affect the election results, but I just don't see it having that much of an impact. To tell you the truth, yeah. I mean, from my reading of the bill, I don't know. I just like the major thing is the voting ID, the ID requirement. I think, and I just don't. Everyone has an ID in this state. Like whether it's whether you have a state ID or a driver's license. I mean, you can't get liquor or anything or do anything really without an ID. So everyone has an ID, and they're really easy to get. That's the nice thing about Georgia. It's interacting with the government's very nice. Unlike I'm from I lived in California for many years, and it's very difficult to even get things like IDs.
Why is that?
It's just a process, the bureaucracy's bigger. They just make things hard for you. It reminds me of Europe in many ways, for better or worse. Dealing with and again I've known about European bureaucracies through my father because he's Greek, and a lot of the things that I had to go through in California kind of reminded me of Europe in terms of there's like really long delays to get things, and you have to wait on very long lines. I mean, like going to the DMV to get a license is like it's just a nightmare.
It's a chore. It's a minute.
Yeah, it's really a nightmare. Yeah. Whereas with Georgia, it's a lot easier. I found just working. You could do a lot of like electronic stuff. There's a lot of good systems here where you could, you could get IDs relatively easily, and so I think that helps a lot. Maybe California got better now. I
Back to
still
the,
remember. Like, I mean, I haven't. No, I thought I don't remember. I haven't really. I haven't interacted with them for a while, thankfully.
wasn't everyone from California moving to Texas or
Yeah,
other parts of the
that's what I
country? That
hear.
seems to be
Yeah,
a
that's what I
rising
hear.
thing that's happening. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
California's has a big brain drain going on right now, and they're all moving to like one place. That's Austin. You know, Austin is like the
Mm-hmm.
new. I think it's going to be the new San Francisco at some point. It might even be,
Yeah.
and maybe give it like 2 or 3 years, because you have all like the. I mean, of course, in San Francisco, you still have Facebook there, like the giants, Google,
Right.
but YouTube, of course, right? That's which is Google company.
Yeah.
But I think you're getting a lot of new talent moving to Austin, and we'll see what happens. I forget what the percentages are in terms of people that left, but it was pretty large. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of changes in Texas moving forward.
I wonder if it's hard to be a startup in Silicon Valley or that part of California, just because you're probably going to get eaten up pretty quick. Like whereas maybe there's a better opportunity for startups in Austin.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I mean, a lot of people have studied this especially in the Bay Area, and
Hmm.
there's I think it depends, right? It could be easier or harder depending on the type of company you're running. Okay, so in Silicon Valley, it's the reason that everyone wants to go to Silicon Valley is because it's a place where everyone knows that there are all of the tech startup, venture capital funds. Everyone is there, and so you could just interact with people all the time, because that's like the whole thing. Just like
Hmm.
having contacts, interacting with people, and getting funding, and you could be talking with one billionaire one day, and then getting funding from him and someone else or her, right, and someone else the next day. And so having that network in the Bay Area is like there's no it's just priceless, right, when it comes to doing things like
Sure.
raising
Yeah.
venture capital. On the other hand, you have a lot more competition because everyone's gone there, right?
Hmm.
So I think there was probably a point at which if you went to the Bay Area and you were doing like a startup tech company, and you wanted venture
Hmm.
capital funding, it was like the perfect time. Maybe that time was like 10 years
Hmm.
ago, 20 years ago, something. But right now, unless you're doing some really, really innovative stuff like with AI, it's just there's still so much competition. It's going to be really hard to
Yeah.
get the interest of anyone in venture capital. But there are more venture capitalists
Yeah.
there, so yeah. So I think people who go to
Yeah.
Austin, they'll probably have, if they have a good idea and a good company, they'll probably have a better chance.
I'm excited to go there one day. I've some family out there, and they've always been calling me for a while, and they just say that the development is unreal that's happened over the last couple of years. So I'm excited to go visit there one day.
Yeah, I've never been there actually either, so me too.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, quickly back to the voting
yeah,
thing, because there was a conversation that was happening. I don't know if it was most of Canada, but I don't know if you know about our voting system. It's like it seems so archaic, because for the longest time I've always thought, let's make this electronic. It'll just make it easier for people to do online voting, which is probably still a good thing.
hmm,
But we just do paper ballots with the check mark, and we've never had issues with anything. I've never heard of any issues, at least in all the elections that I voted in. And so what I see what's kind of happening, you know, in the states, and maybe it's because my understanding is like the states control sort of how the voting system happens, like the
yeah,
mechanism for voting and all that.
right,
And maybe that sort of is sort of a bigger issue. Whereas Canada's kind of more national. You do have election, like I'm from Alberta. We have elections Alberta. There's elections Ontario or whatever. But generally, the system is the same across the board.
yeah.
But yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, man, this paper system seems to work, and maybe we shouldn't be changing things. So
Yeah, I mean, I don't like I like the paper system too. For the most part, in the places I've been to, there's been so California. When you go to vote, you fill out a paper ballot, and then they slide it through like a machine, and it's read and recorded.
mm,
And I think they got voting machines recently, of course. And here there's a combination of voting machines and paper ballots. So you can either choose to get and depending on the precinct you're in, you can either choose to get a paper ballot, or you could choose to use a voting machine. Personally, now when you're talking about online voting, that's a whole different thing, right? So that's like
Yeah.
that's like probably a system that the federal government probably wants to develop, but if they were to develop that system, they're going to get a lot of opposition from the states for sure, because although I don't know, like maybe the states themselves will develop some kind of online voting system, which would be really interesting. But yeah, an online voting system where you could like vote for home on a website, that is something I think that's going to occur in the future for sure. I just don't know how it's going to work. I mean, a lot of people were claiming it's going to be a kind of blockchain system, and something like that. You could use something called a decentralized identity to match your identity, a digital identity, to your state records in order to be able to vote.
Right.
And I definitely see something like that happening in the future. And with that is going to be a lot of problems, a lot of controversy. I think all states might not adopt it. I think there's going to be some states that adopt it first and others that don't. But online voting, I definitely see that being something that's going to happen in the future. But I agree with you. I think a paper ballot standard is the best. I don't really see any reason to. I mean, I'm despite the fact that I study technology for a living, I'm kind of like anti-tech in a lot of ways.
Okay.
So that's definitely one of them. I like the paper ballot, especially because you can just have an audit trail, which is nice. And now that's why people are saying a blockchain is a good idea.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be like decentralized though, in the sense of like Bitcoin is decentralized. Right. It would be like the state has a blockchain, right? And then, in fact, I was actually discussing this exact topic with some people at Georgia Tech. So the state would have like a blockchain, and they would kind of give you access to an electronic ballot, and then that when you voted, your information would be recorded on the blockchain that could not be altered. And then there would have to be some system where the votes were validated by the localities if you were to stay within the framework of U.S. law. And so maybe a precinct or something, people working at the precinct would see the votes on a blockchain. They would say, okay, well, these are good. So, I mean, you can't alter them anyway, right? So
but that doesn't. How does that really change? It's almost like the current system, right? Somebody from the precinct has to validate the votes coming in anyways.
Yeah.
And that seems to be where some of the controversy is. It's like, who are these people validating these votes?
Yeah.
But obviously, I
mean, the interesting thing with the online voting stuff would be, like, if people are voting online. I mean, I don't think that there's ever going to be a fully online voting system, right? I think it's going to be a hybrid thing, at least for the foreseeable future, where you have some precincts that, unless there's some really vast change that the federal government implements, that would have to be a constitutional challenge, right? But I think what's going to happen is you're going to have systems where you have you have all the precincts open so people can vote in person. You're going to have the absentee ballots, right, as always. And then you're also going to have maybe an option to do it online. And so the interesting thing is, like, how are people at the precincts going to validate online stuff? I actually, to tell you the truth, that it wouldn't be that hard, really. Because you could just, for certain people on the blockchain who live within a precinct, you could just add them to the roll of voters, and like a final record. So you could like pipe all the data, you see what I mean? From all the sources to one single source that everyone could see. So that's kind of what I see happening in the future. And unless there's some like drastic election law change. So I think
blockchain is just one of those techs that's just going to enable a bunch of things, hey?
What's that?
I was going to say blockchain is just one of those techs that's just going to enable a bunch of things, and so why wouldn't it enable online voting?
Oh yeah, definitely. Blockchain is going to be how all transactions occur in the future, in my opinion. Yeah. Yeah. I think eventually they're going to get rid of cash. And by, like, there is a they. Like, they are the central banks, right? Because,
Yeah, yeah.
right, so if you look, every single country in the world has a central bank. So Canada has a central bank, U.S. has a central bank, of course, Federal Reserve, right? Mexico has a central bank, right? In fact, I recently was working on a project where I wanted to kind of understand how the central banks are developing a digital currency and like what they're looking for in this digital currency. It's called the central bank digital currency. And I realized, while working on that project, that like every country in the world has a central bank. It's crazy, right? So I think what's going to happen in the future with the blockchain stuff, I don't know what's going to happen to Bitcoin or Ethereum. I really don't know, right? Or the other cryptos. I've been involved in that market for quite a bit. But I do think what's going to happen in the future is that you're going to have central banks issuing a digital currency directly to people. Or maybe it's possible that they could have a system where they're going to issue the digital currency to banks and then still have the banks around. But I don't, I just, technically speaking, if they wanted to, they could have a system where they actually have a direct link to people, the public, and all of the transactions that occur in an economy are on their blockchain, which is called a permission blockchain. Now, permission, I don't know, are you familiar with this term at all?
No.
So there are two types of blockchains. There are permissionless blockchains, and there are permissioned blockchains. And permissionless blockchains are basically decentralized blockchains like Bitcoin, like Bitcoin's blockchain, Ethereum's blockchain, where the validation of transactions is required. What's required for validating transactions is that a group of validators validate that those transactions in a decentralized fashion, and that makes the kind of transaction go through. And there's no like central control of the blockchain. Now, technically speaking, you could probably, with blockchain analytics, you could definitely trace transactions, and you could figure out like, especially when you see really big transactions, you could figure out like, whose wallet is a particular wallet address, and what other people they were dealing with. But it requires a little bit of work. I mean, it's not. It would require some more data analysis. Now, a permission blockchain, on the other hand, is basically a totally private blockchain that is run by a centralized institution like the central banks, and it's kind of like a one-way mirror, right? They have all the information about all the transactions, so they issue a digital currency. The digital currency is basically a trackable piece of data. That's what you could think of it as. And they could also issue the wallets. So now if they issue the wallets and they issue the currency, and if you have a digital ID, well, then you basically have all your transactions on their blockchain, and
Right.
they become much more influential, right? And so I think that's kind of what's going to happen. And so the reason I'm mentioning that, because you mentioned blockchain, is that going back to the voting issue, you could adopt that kind of technology, the exact same type of technology in a voting context, but at the state level, right? So a state could develop its own blockchain. It's actually really easy to develop a blockchain. I mean, you could do a computer exercise, like if you know how to program in Python or something like that. You could actually write your own little blockchain that you have control over, and that that you could view transactions on. So it's actually not that difficult. So yeah, I mean, I think in the future what you're going to see is either an abrupt or a gradual transition from cash to digital currency, central bank digital currency, and maybe there's still going to be cryptos around that serve useful functions, like Ethereum, for sure. Probably not for sure. I'm not going to say for sure, but probably Chainlink, which is it's not really a crypto. It's more of like a data exchange system, Oracle service, right? XRP, which is like a centralized settling system. Stellar, all those guys. You're going to see those still around, but there's going to like there'll probably be like some kind of digital currency where every transaction that's occurs is on this big ledger. That's really that the central banks happen to have. So control.
I wonder if Jason, that the desires for like a cryptocurrency, my understanding, one of the desires is around that decentralization, is taking this sort of power away from these centralized institutions. But I wonder if it would be different for voting. I would think that people wouldn't want that as decentralized. They probably want it kind of more permission based. Whereas, because you wouldn't, it would be, I think people would have a hard time with that. So the thought of having, that's interesting, the thought of like the central banks coming up with digital currencies and having it on their own blockchain, there probably would be a natural adoption that happens. But I suspect there probably would still be some resistance that would drive people to like sort of the current kind of cryptos out there.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there would be a lot of resistance, right? Not just a little.
Yeah.
Because the plan is, at least for what I've seen from the digital euro and the digital yuan, the plan is basically, the digital euro in particular, they had sent a survey out to bunch of people in Germany, and they asked them, while we're developing a digital euro, what's your biggest concern? Of course, people said the biggest concern that they have is privacy. They don't want central banks to be tracking their transactions, right? Or preventing them from transacting, things like that. So last time I checked, I remember they were like, them saying, "Oh, well, that's cool. So, okay, so how about this? You can have privacy for small transactions, but not big ones, right? The big transactions where we're going to it's going to be full transparency on our end, right? So then you might be wondering, well, what's a small or big transaction? And like the first thing that came to mind was like, maybe they mean like 20,000 euros or whatever, 10,000 euros. No, 50 euros. So that's the small transaction. And I mean, with inflation, it's obviously going to be higher, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's obviously going to. I mean, the what the 50 euros could buy you with inflation is obviously going to get lower, right? And so, So I mean, I think that's one of the proposals that are out there, and so there will be a lot of pushback, and I think that might drive people to buy things like Monero and Bitcoin and things like that, like those types of cryptocurrencies. But it's also going to hurt them if the central banks try to, or government policymakers try to ban those cryptocurrencies, which they probably will, or at least very heavily regulate certain types of cryptocurrencies that they don't want around. Now, that doesn't mean that you still can't use them. I mean, I think they tried to ban Bitcoin in Nigeria, and people still use it. Like no one, because it's decentralized, right? You could do stuff like that, but it will make it a lot more difficult to use it. So, I mean, we'll see what happens, but it'll be interesting no matter what. There's definitely going to be a lot of pushback, and I don't think they're going to go from like the current system, which is cash and banks and just regular fiat currency, to only digital currency. It's going to be slow. I think it's going to be you'll have the availability of a digital dollar or euro, whatever it is.
Yeah.
At first, with cash that you can get from your bank, and then eventually that'll just be phased out. The cash part will be phased out, and then there's only going to be the digital currency. In my opinion, I mean, I could be wrong. So,
I'm sure you're right. Governments never really sort of do a 180 on anything, let alone
because they don't have
financial system or how our currencies are going to roll out.
Yeah, exactly.
That probably makes sense. I wonder though if going to linking this to sort of democratic institutions and democracy in general, if governments can't necessarily, or regulators can't keep up with where technology is going and what people sort of really want. So you talk about sort of the needs that people have when it comes to crypto. if governments can't come up with, an alternative option, that's just going to sort of perpetuate this sort of lack of trust or faith in democratic institutions going forward. And that's sort of what I wonder. And that actually kind of prompted the bigger conversation I wanted to have with you. It's just like these disruptive techs and what the influence is going to be on, the mindset that people have or the faith that people have in sort of, typical Western liberal democracies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and kind of really interesting point. So, I teach a class on politics. It's called Politics and Technology at the University of Georgia, and in that class, I assign a reading by I guess you can call him a technologist or a sociologist of technology, named Jacques Ellul, who's a French, very interesting person. And one thing really struck me about Ellul. So in his book called The Technological Society, he basically gives us a picture of how technology will shape all different spheres of life in terms of economics, in terms of politics, and things like that. And there's one particular quote that really caught my attention there. And that is that he made the claim that, in this quote, that, and I'm kind of paraphrasing here, that technology will eventually make Western liberal values, like classical liberal values, it will make them moot. In the sense of, in this sense, right? Now he's not saying that, the technology itself will somehow render these, the values as useless or whatever. His claim was that the so-called technocratic class would be so far ahead of the government that they would just basically run things, right? And so if they run things, then there's really no, these things like rights and things like that, it's just not going to be as important because they have more power and they have more money, they have more power, and where they don't have power, they can buy power, right? Or they can influence power, influence the government. So that's certainly something that, I think is concerning, and I think he has a pretty good point there, to tell you the truth. So yeah, so that
It seems like that's kind of a little bit is already kind of that is sort of happening, right? You're seeing this play happen within the tech sector and how, congressional politicians just don't understand really that business, and the tech sector seems to just be pulling fast ones over them because government doesn't have the expertise, right?
Not only that, they don't have the expertise, nor do they have the resources. I mean, Google is way more powerful than the U.S. Congress, in my opinion. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it is what it is, right? Google has worldwide influence. I mean, if you just consider the scope of influence. I mean, obviously the U.S. Congress has worldwide influence and things like that. But really, where the tech powers, where they derive their power, their not authority per se, but where they derive their influence, is from the ability. It's literally two things. Like, first of all, the data, right? No one has more data than Facebook. The U.S. government doesn't have nearly. Think about it. The U.S. government has what? The census, right? They have your social security number. They probably, obviously NSA and stuff like that. They have surveillance, things like that. But that information is nowhere near as, let's say, how can I put it? It's nowhere near as complete as the type of information that Facebook has or Twitter has.
For sure.
Because they have everything you say, right? And you put it there, so you do it voluntarily, right? They have all your personal details. They have, the information, like people like to check in where they go, right? So they have that information. They have information about who your friends are. The U.S. government has no way. How are they going to know who your friends are, right? There's no way that they would know. They have information about your political ideology, about your, your taste in food,
location.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And so there's no question in my mind that it's that data that gives them power. And then if you combine that with AI, oh man, you have all the ability, you have all the data from all these people, and then with AI, you can use that to make predictions about what people are going to say, what people are going to do, things to censor. You could, you can, and you could change people's behavior, right? Because they're, whether people like it or not. I know there was like a controversy about a Facebook study where they did a big experiment on people, and people, everyone was very angry about that. Right? It was like an A/B test more than an experiment. But they're doing experiments all the time. I mean, I still think they're doing experiments all the time on Facebook.
Yeah.
And it's very subtle. Like the way you do experiments in a context like that is, you just randomly tweak one or two or three or four posts, whatever it is, in someone's feed, right? Or maybe you change the way you display information, right? And that's an experimental treatment, and then they have like thousands of people like me and social scientists designing these experiments, and then going back, analyzing the data, and trying to figure out what the treatment effects are. Like if we changed this piece of someone's feed and maybe gave them the opposite information that was opposing their ideology, did we change how they were thinking about a certain issue over the course of time? You could do all stuff like this, if you combine text analytics, AI, and things like that. It's just crazy. So I mean, but just these social media companies themselves, and again, it's all voluntary. No one's, there's no force involved at all. I mean, everyone, people give their data, and they like interacting on social media sites. With that info, you could both influence behavior, and you can, you could learn about what people do, where they are. You don't need surveillance. Like, what do you need surveillance? Like, you don't need surveillance. I mean, look at what happened on the January 6th, right? Everyone had their phones with them, right? In the January 6th Capitol riots, right? Or everyone had their phones with them, and they were probably on. Maybe they weren't even on Facebook. I don't know, right? But they were able to like do a whole sweep of everyone, right? So that's not even the NSA. You just ask Facebook for the data, or
well, that's what I was going to say. Is like the government, these governing institutions, FBI, whoever is involved in this, they're going to go to these tech companies probably for the answers, right? Like, and the tech companies have all this power. Like everything that you just tell me, Jason, makes me think that nothing good comes out of this for democracy. But what are your thoughts on this? Like, is democracy as we kind of know it, the way we engage with the electorate, the way sort of we elect politicians, all that kind of stuff, these institutions that have been established for years and years and years, is it kind of under threat? Like, what's the influence of AI in all this in politics? Like,
yeah, so
it's a big question. I know.
No. It's a great question. And I have some thoughts on it. So I think it is and it isn't, and this is why. And it all depends on. I think it all depends on how people react to things, right? So this tech, Facebook, Twitter, Google, I know it gets demonized a lot as big tech, and there are lots of problems with it. There's like surveillance and all this other stuff, right? They're very powerful. They have all this data, But with this tech, people are able to learn about things that they would never have been able to learn about. They're able to find information really quickly about their polling station. They're able to, they're just able to interact with, all this information that they weren't able to interact with in the past, and that is very empowering, right? And I think in that sense, the fact that there's all that information out there and people are able to access it, I mean, information that only, specialists would have availability for too, like, I mean, scientific journals and things like that. That's something that is really unprecedented. And I know a lot of people would say, well, there's all these like non-experts reading and talking about things like scientific literature and things like that. But there's also a lot of people who are experts engaging with it and who are pointing out legitimate flaws and things, in academic research and journalistic research and so on. That is really amazing. Now, that being said, so I think the fact that the information is available to everyone and we can discuss things in an open forum, that's very helpful for democratic institutions.
Positive, yeah.
So, on the other hand, there's a lot of the companies themselves have a lot of power and influence in terms of how they can affect someone's thoughts or behavior in an indirect way, right? So a lot of studies, some of the studies have shown with Facebook that, if you show people certain things on their feed, you could change their mood, right? You could even on Twitter or something like that, if you portrayed something as being, you could get people angry, right? By manipulating their feed. You could make them. You can never make someone do something directly using these technologies, but you can spur people to action through triggering them or whatever it might be, making them angry, and that can have very important and large scale effects. Now, the extent to which these companies are empowered to influence behavior in that way is entirely dependent upon the extent to which people are influenced by them, right? So a lot depends on whether a lot of the whatever behavioral manipulations that that a lot of these companies use are effective or not, in terms of how much power they have and how much the extent to which they're able to either circumvent or lessen the viability of the democratic process, right? So that's really those are the two things that that we're facing in terms of tech's influence on democracy. So, like, on the one hand, you have the amazing amount of information that's available, unprecedented amount of information, and then on the other hand, you have the ability of these tech companies to influence behavior in ways that no politician would have been able to do, before directly like that. So there's
Well, and as somebody who's on the recipient side of the tech, it's almost unavoidable. Like, it's so hard to not get influenced by some of this tech. Even if you, like, I try to turn off my location data, and everyone's seen the social dilemma, and I'm sure people have tried to sort of respond based on that. But even if you turn off your location data, Google is integrated with a lot of like public transit systems and the mapping and all that kind of stuff, and it's just like, to some extent, it's almost unavoidable. I don't know how you get around that, right? Without sort of
there's no way to
being linked to some of these tech companies.
Yeah, I don't think there's really any way to get around stuff like location. I mean, if someone really wants to know your location, they can figure it out just by using like, I think there's like certain features of phones, probably backdoors and things like that. Again, I'm not 100% sure, but there's ways to figure out your location within a certain radius of a cell tower. So, and with 5G, which is, it's more like densely packed, kind of low millimeter waves, it's going to be much easier to do things like that, right? Because like 5G, Like people think of 5G towers, like they're going to be these big towers. They're not. They're just like little poles, you know. But they're all over the
Mm-hmm.
place. There's a lot of them
Mm-hmm.
um, because that's how 5G works. It's very localized, you know. It's
Right.
just that there are a
Yeah.
lot of,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, in certain places there's going to be more 5G than others, right? So with that kind of stuff, yeah, you're probably going to see more a greater ability to track precise location even without your consent, you know. So not much you can do about that, unfortunately.
No.
Yeah.
Jason, one of the disruptive techs that I'm kind of interested in, and I think that some of your research, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of leverages this, is around machine learning and deep learning. And maybe if you don't mind, Kyle and I tried to explain this in one of our podcasts. We probably just didn't do it justice. Would you mind kind of just talking about sort of how deep learning works? And then my understanding is that you've kind of applied that to looking at sort of how politicians, I think like through their images or whatever that they portray online, how they you've used that technology to kind of do some analysis on how politicians portray themselves.
Yeah, sure. So deep learning is something that it sounds like really exotic and mysterious to many people, but the basics of it is this, right? You have some input data, right? That input data could be an image. It could be, a description, like a person's characteristics, right? Whatever, right? And you want to make some prediction about that input. So in the case of an image, let's say you want to make a prediction about whether there's a car and or let's just stick with the car example, like whether there's a car in the image or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So deep learning is simply a machine learning technique, and a machine learning technique is just a prediction machine that allows you to take a really complicated input, like an image, and I'll explain why image is complicated in a second, and get out a prediction with a high probability of being correct, right? So now the way deep learning works is it's a little bit complicated, but the simple explanation of it is that it has something called layers, and each layer has a lot of parameters. If you're familiar with things like regression analysis, a parameter are like the beta coefficients and things like that. And so what deep learning does is that it allows you to take data that's very high dimensional, pass it through this algorithm that has all these different parameters, and that algorithm is able to make estimates linking the parameter values to the output, which is a label you're interested in, right? Like a car or something like that. Now, the reason that images are so hard to deal with is because images are not what you think they are when you see them. Like when you see an image, your brain automatically recognizes the things in the image, a car, whatever, a boat, or whatever it might be in a particular image. But a computer doesn't see an image like that at all. A computer simply sees an image as a grid of pixel intensity values that are go between 0 and 255. Okay. Now in a color image, let's say you have a 50 by 50 image, right? 50 by 50 pixel image, right? In a color image, that would be represented on the machine as 3 50 by 50 matrices, like 50 rows, 50 columns. And those matrices have 3 what are called channels, red, green, blue, RGB, right? And each of those channels has a pixel intensity value that goes from 0 to 255. So that 50 by 50 image is, if you think about it, right, it's like, what's 50 times 50? It's like 2,500, right?
2,500, yeah.
Pixel values for one matrix, but multiply that by 3, right? So, then you have, 7,500, right? pixel values just for that really small image. And the point of what deep learning does is that it's supposed to take all of that pixel value data, and which is, again, it's just numbers, it's not intensity numbers, right? And it's supposed to somehow make sense of whether this pattern of numbers, pixel numbers, are associated with this type of object. Now, the problem sounds not that difficult, when you're thinking about an object like a car taken from one perspective. But remember, not only are there different types of cars, but there's all types of different perspectives, and then there's all types of different colors, and there's all types of different shapes, and all these other things. So the thing that deep learning does really well is that with enough data, you can train it or teach it to recognize this pixel pattern known as a car, or whatever it is you want it to recognize, in a way that you have a very high probability of being correct, for in any situation, really, or any scenario. And that's why people are so excited about deep learning. And that's why it's used pretty much in all of the image recognition software that government uses and things like that, right? So they all use deep learning algorithms. But really, I mean, at the end of the day, it sounds mysterious, but it's really just like a prediction algorithm. There's you teach it to identify patterns in pixels that correspond to different objects. And then once you teach it that, then it's just able to go out in the world and to just start labeling things. Like you train this a deep learning algorithm to identify cars, and so every time you throw an image in it, it'll give you the probability of a car being part of that image, and then that's kind of how that works. So.
It just kind of learns on its own, right? Like that's sort of the next level.
Well, it does. It kind of like so.
Okay.
It learns on its own in the sense that. So the way that all machine learning works is that you have to train it. So, if I wanted to make a prediction about whether a car was in an image, I would have to have a database of 100,000 images. And those images would have to be labeled as containing a car or not, right? So then what you would do in a deep learning context or any machine learning context is that you would just tell the algorithm to take that data using the pixel data that you have from the images and to make a prediction about whether there's a car or not. So in that sense, in that part of the learning process, it learns the pixel, like the correspondence between the pixel patterns and the object that you want to make predictions about, right? So it kind of learns by itself in that context. But you see, it's not really that different if you've ever studied statistics or done just data analysis using multiple regression.
Right.
You could it's like saying that the deep learning learns about the pixel patterns itself is like saying that a regression model learns about the coefficient values when you just make a simple linear regression. The way in which these algorithms learn is very similar in that way. You're just estimating parameters, right?
Interesting.
Now, then there's another process. It's called the testing portion of any machine learning process, where then you see how accurate your predictions are. And so that's the part where you try to gauge what out of all the cars that I had labeled as cars that I know are labeled as cars, what percentage of those were correctly identified and things like that. All of machine learning is really that testing and training, testing process. Right, but it does learn by itself technically, but you have to tell it what you want it to look for. Okay, so that's really if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Just to kind of wrap this up, maybe overall, do you feel like are you worried about democracy? I know it's a big question, but are you worried about democracy with some of these disruptive techs? Is there a way to summarize? Could you summarize sort of really what you're you're concerned about, or do you think that there are incredible opportunities that maybe we're not seeing or being or losing sight of?
Yeah, I think there's with these technologies. My biggest concern is that they will be centrally controlled. Because if they're centrally controlled, that is a problem, right? And if you're not, a lot of these technologies are extremely powerful, and so if the internet somehow becomes like centrally controlled, which it's not right now. I mean, you have lots of different internet service providers, and the internet service providers don't really get involved at all, right? It's very decentralized in that sense. And so that allows a lot of freedom of speech, a lot of freedom of discussion, a lot of kind of freedom of expression more generally. It allows communities to develop online, which is a very, very nice thing. And in many ways, it almost even allows local businesses to thrive and things like that, So as long as there's that decentralized nature of the internet, I think that, democracy, it'll be fine. It'll actually, probably promote democracy more, right? I mean, I think it'll be good thing for democracy. On the other hand,
Interesting.
If it, for whatever reason, if it becomes not decentralized, where maybe you have to, say, have a state ID to access it, or to access certain sites or something like that, like the way that kind of China does things, then the internet itself just becomes a control system, right? It becomes a very large-scale control system where you could still have a lot of freedom within it, but it's more difficult,
Yeah.
So a lot of it depends on what happens in the future.
Very
And,
interesting.
I don't know what's going to happen, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting. Last two questions. They're just about you. I don't know if you had a chance to see the questions I sent you, but if there were 5 people, dead or alive, that you could have a meal with, share a meal with, who would those 5 people be?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I really couldn't get past. I really couldn't get past like a couple, like maybe one or two, but I'll kind of give you. I'll kind of give you a couple. So
Sure.
Rocket Lowell would definitely be on the top, on the kind of the top of my list for sure. The technology sociologist that I was talking about. I really
Oh, the French guy.
the French guy, yeah. I think he died recently. Actually, he's
Oh,
a lot of his work was pretty recent. I would definitely want to talk to Saint Augustine because he has a lot of interesting works. I've read some of his stuff. I find it really fascinating. I would want to talk to Richard Feynman, who I admire tremendously as kind of a person and a physicist. I think he's just really an incredible person. Let me see. Who else would I want to? Who else would I want to get? See, that's the problem. I had definitely Dostoevsky would be another person who I admire tremendously.
Who's that? Sorry.
Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian author. Are
Okay.
you familiar with his stuff like Crime and Punishment? And,
No, I'm not. Yeah.
oh, okay, yeah. So he's a really amazing fiction author. Brothers Karamazov. Sound familiar?
Okay.
Yeah, he's really awesome.
Yeah.
And other than that, I don't have any political leaders. Most of these people are like intellectuals because they happen to be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, there's one more person who I have right behind me in a collection, and that is Philip K. Dick. So Philip K. Dick was probably one of the most famous science fiction writers of the 20th century, and he developed a lot of the ideas for movies like Minority Report and Scanner Darkly, Blade Runner, and things like that. So he is an extremely interesting person. He's a little nuts, but he's extremely interesting. And so, yeah, I would definitely want to hang out with him because
Cool.
I really just want to hear what he has to say. So.
You just want these cerebral conversations over dinner, hey?
Yeah, I just want to hear how these guys. I want to know how these people think. I mean, especially in a more
Yeah, that's cool.
just in a more free flowing way, because if you know
Yeah.
someone through their writing, it's a different thing. It's more formal.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Beyond the circle of life, Jason, what do you know for sure?
What do I know for sure? I know that I know that we are meant to have free will. That would be my yeah. That's one thing I know for sure. We are meant to have free will. Whether we're allowed to exercise it is another question. But I know that we are meant to have free will. So that's one thing I know for sure.
Yeah. Jason, I appreciate your time. There's actually so much more I wanted to talk to you about. And so who knows, maybe if you're open to it, we can do it again sometime. I just appreciate you, first of all, just even answering my email. I sent Jason just like a random email and he happily responded. So I always appreciate that. Jason, I'll put all your information on our show notes and all that, and you can check out Jason's research. Jason, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And hopefully, I don't know if you've ever been to this part of Canada, but the Rockies are beautiful. Yeah, so I'm gonna do a little plug for that. But we'd love to see you out here one time. But take care of yourself and appreciate your time today.
All right. Yeah, you too. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks for your time.